ancestors were ripping off my European ancestors, something wrong.
Yeah.
India has massively underplayed its Buddhist heritage because there's no one waving the flag.
Yeah. You have so many stories, but I'm assuming that's still, just a sliver of, what all transpired. 1500 is a very long period of time.
The British used to lay out their dead on hillsides like Tibet or the Parsis and have them eaten by wild animals. Ajanta is absolutely number one. Anyone who's listening to this podcast, get a ticket. I, like you, always assume that the Silk Road is an idea that's always been there.
Yeah.
Bullshit. There are grains of Indian black pepper up the nose of the mummy of Ramesses II.
Really?
Literally.
Wow.
Unlike China, which is quite often united in most of history, India is mostly disunited. Apparently, the Malus of that period had a very connoisseur taste for South Italian wine. 120 tons of ivory. That's a lot of dead elephants. Right? This weird fact, which I don't think people in India have taken in, the largest temple of the world is not in India. How weird is that?
William, welcome to Sparks.
Very nice to be on. We haven't seen each other since the Jaipur Lit Fest last year.
It's great to see. I mean, you guys are doing incredible job with Jaipur Lit Fest. Now it has become part of my annual calendar. I have to be in Jaipur in January.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's so inspiring, these vibrant crowds. Namita was on this podcast as well a while back, and it was great learning about history of the festival and how you guys have made from pretty much nothing to, I think, one of the largest festivals in the world.
Well, one of the nice things about it is the way that it's inspired others to do the same elsewhere in India. And I'm here in Bangalore because of the brilliant Bangalore Lit Fest, which I have to say was incredibly sparky this year. I've never seen crowds here like that. Each year it grows, each year it gets buzzier. It's really, really good this year.
Yeah, I think as fellow book lovers, great to see these book festivals do well. I think the more people read books, I think it's just a lot of great things for the world.
We keep hearing about how this is the age of short attention spans, but podcasts like yours, which are an hour long, are flourishing, and hundreds of thousands of people are listening to them. Hundreds of thousands are coming to book festivals. I think that if you engage people and interest them, they will invest in long form.
And your podcast empire is a testimony to that. I mean, it's become immensely popular in the last 2.5 years. And in preparation for our conversation, I was going through, and they're so captivating. It's just in 35 minutes you get such entertaining yet very accurate, detailed account of very relevant history.
I think I have if the session we just did on the Empire podcast at the Bangalore Lit Fest is anything to go by, I have Bangalore traffic to thank for. People say everyone in the audience said they listen to it when they're stuck in traffic jams.
Yeah, there's one advantage of being in traffic. I used to work in Bay Area long time ago, and I had a 45-minute commute. So I bought this this audio cassettes at that time. I know there's a whole selection called 100 Great Books, and every day one book on the way to work, other way back. And I started enjoying being in traffic. I used to look forward to that 45 minutes. Yeah, maybe some.
When I was writing Golden Road, before I started my podcast, I was commuting in the summer from London, where I have a house, to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where I did a lot of my research. And it's exactly an hour from door to door.
Yeah.
And I used to listen to the Rest is History podcast, which is the same stable as Empire Goalhanger. And you're right, it's something you really look forward to. You kind of put your seatbelt on, press the start button, and exactly the right light length for the journey.
So maybe there is some upside to Bangalore traffic. We can look at the bright side. William, last couple of weeks I read 2 of your books.
I apologize, Mukesh.
No, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it's the best part of my last couple of weeks. This book, Golden Road, the first thought that occurred to me, there is this period of almost 1500 years from roughly 250 BC to about 1300 AD, where India was giving so much to the world in terms of, lot of new ideas, export of culture, very thriving trade with various parts of the world. That history is kind of lost on us. So first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time in such deeply, thoroughly researched book, where, for all of us in India, I think it makes sense, as India is rising, we are taking more and more pride in where India is, where it's going, but understanding our roots and where we once were, just recognizing that is outstanding. So I really enjoyed reading that book. I'll highly recommend to anyone listening to this podcast. But I want to also understand your motivation. What prompted you to go so far back? Because recent history is relatively easy because you have all the archives and records and so on. But how do you even research for something so ancient?
This actually is where I started off when I was a kid. I was obsessed with ancient Egypt, and my first ever trip to London. I begged my parents to take me to the British Museum to see the Tutankhamun show, which was a big deal, with queues going halfway through London to get into it. And I remember hating London, but loving the Tutankhamun exhibition. I was a little kid from Scotland. I was used to fields and mountains and seaside, and I'd never seen anything so horrific as the London traffic and stuff. I wasn't enamored of my first visit. But all my childhood and teens, I was into that. And I spent my summer holidays digging on archaeological excavations. I went first to Orkney and then to an extraordinary site in southern England, because in the Neolithic period, the British used to lay out their dead on hillsides like Tibet or the Parsis and have them eaten by wild animals and by birds.
Oh, wow.
And this site was an extraordinary site called Hambledon Hill.
This is about 10,000 years ago?
This is about 3,500 BC, so 5,000 years.
5,000, so it's not too far.
And this same practice of going on. And then when I left school, I went up to Cambridge to study archaeology. And my plan for the period between leaving school and going up to university was to go to Iraq and dig on Assyrian sites there. And it was the fact that Saddam Hussein closed down the British School of Archaeology that ended propelling me to just go with a friend to India, because my other plans had been cancelled. So I just jumped on a plane with him. I had no particular interest in India. I had no particular urge to see it.
This was what, 80s?
1984.
84, okay.
I was 18.
Oh, that was also very eventfully here as well.
Eventually, luckily later in the year. This was January 84. And I spent my year off going around the ancient sites of India. So I went to Sanchi, Janta, Laura, Tanjore Big Temple, and all this sort of stuff. Haridwar, I was based initially in Dehradun, so I went to Haridwar and Rishikesh first.
Yeah, I grew up in Haridwar,
so I was teaching in Dehradun,
amazing.
in St. Joseph's Academy, and that was it's just an hour's bus ride from Haridwar. So anyway, this was where I started off, and I think my younger self would be very surprised that I ended up spending 20 years writing about colonial and late Mughal history. I ended up writing 4 books over 20 years about that. And
all outstanding books.
Thank you. But anyway, as soon as it was done, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and I actually was already working on the Golden Road a bit during the writing of Anarchy. And actually, at one point, I went down to Ajanta, and there was this magical moment when I walked into Cave 10. And I knew Ajanta quite well. I first went in 84 in this first trip, been many times since. And I walked into Cave 10. This is now, I suppose, 2014, 2015. And there were all these frescoes I'd never seen before. And I knew the caves well, so I couldn't understand what had happened. Where were these new frescoes from? It turned out that the ASI, without telling anybody, had cleaned the cave very well, done a very good restoration job. A guy called Manager Singh was in charge of it. And he had uncovered a series of frescoes which had always been there, but when the Nizam of Hyderabad was in charge of that area, he brought in some Italian restorers who cleaned it in 1870 or something, and then fatally put varnish. And the varnish attracted the bat shit from the bats that were on the roof, and within 10 years, they were completely obscured.
Wow.
So all the surveys of Ajanta, which took place after 1880, do not include these frescoes.
Amazing.
Anyway, so when I went there and saw this, I took 6 months off the Anarchy and wrote a whole series of, because these were not just the oldest frescoes of Ajanta. 150 BC, which is 700 years before the later caves.
Incredible.
600 years. So the same distance like the Lodi Gardens and Gurgaon. There's a huge period of history difference. It also became apparent that these were actually the oldest Buddhist frescoes in the world. So I took 6 months off and wrote a whole series of articles. You're not going to get a chance like that. Seize the opportunity. Photograph them. The ASI were very kind. Let me take the glass down. Really do detailed photography of every inch. And then wrote stuff in Marg, in New York Review of Books, and The Guardian. And then I had to go finish Anarchy. So the first thing I did as soon as it was over was to go back to that area, that world. And it was COVID. I started work in March 2019 and the lockdown came almost immediately. I am an honorary fellow of the Bodleian Library, and they have this incredible search engine. So while even Amazon couldn't deliver to my farm in the middle of the lockdown in Delhi, online you were able to summon up all these scholarly articles from the Oxford University system. And I had the most fascinating lockdown. I know lots of people had a miserable time, and I don't want to sound smug or something. This book was incubated in COVID.
Outstanding. And just so this, maybe that you're saying the visit to that Ajanta's cave was an inspiration, and maybe I can just go on a tangent for a second. As someone who has never been to Ajanta, and I think I'm assuming a lot of people listening to this will not be. What is your recommendation? I think we are probably just missing out a huge part of our heritage is a global heritage. Nalanda, Ajanta, and many other sites. I'm sure you've been to pretty much all of them by now.
So the first thing to say, I think, is that because there are so few Buddhists in India today, it's my view that India has massively underplayed its Buddhist heritage because there's no one waving the flag for it anymore. If you're a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Christian or a Jain, this is not your religion, and you don't feel necessarily particular pride about it. And the Buddhist sites in India are astonishing. And this was once, there was, in the period 150, 200 years after Ashoka, there's far more evidence of the Buddhist religion than there is of anything else. Because in those days, Vedic sacrifices were in temporary altars. You didn't have the massive temples that you begin to get in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century. There were temples in wood and bamboo from about 150 BC, but they've disappeared. So there's a whole world of Buddhist heritage. Ajanta is absolutely number one. Anyone that's listening to this podcast, get a ticket to Aurangabad is the base. If you're rich and don't like discomfort, there's fancy hotels in Aurangabad. But I recommend staying in the Maharashtra. Is it Maharashtra? Maharashtra tourism bungalow, which is just below the caves, and you can spend the night there. It's very simple. It's not fancy, but to be alone in those hills in the evening and to be able to sit out and watch.
All right, I'm taking mental note to try to go there next year for sure.
If you want to be comfy, bring your own sheets.
Actually, I was scheduled to go there in 2020, and then COVID happens, and probably I ended up canceling that. But I think better late than never. So
the other site you mentioned, Nalanda, is the other extraordinary site. And to be honest, I hadn't been, although I'd seen Ajanta as long ago as 1984, I hadn't been to Nalanda till 4 years ago. And it turns out that there is a 90-minute flight, is it, if not even less, is it 80-minute flight from Delhi to Bodh Gaya. Very good Indigo flight. And then it's a 2 or 3 hour drive across. Again, I'd always imagined Bihar to be a sort of slight wasteland. Bihar, beautiful in winter if you go in wintertime.
The other note that I'm taking is I think some of all these sites, probably deserve their own podcast at some point.
Nalanda, certainly. There's a wonderful book coming out next year by my friend Shailendra Raj Mehta, who has been working for 20 years on Nalanda. Oh, wow. And he's going to be, I think, knocking everyone's boots off because he's shown. I talk about this very briefly in Golden Road. But he's going to do a whole book about it, how the kind of ideas of Nalanda influenced first the Islamic madrasas and then the universities of Europe.
Incredible. And we'll look forward to
I lay it out as a vague possibility in this book. He says come up with proof for this. So,
and I think there's a lot of material in your book as well. And I learned so much about Nalanda, but we'll come to that. So let's just start with the title of the book itself. I think early on in the book, you make the case that, Silk Road is world famous. Everyone, talks about it. And we imagine, in fact, including me, that Silk Road has been there forever, for thousands of years, and this thriving trade between Europe and China, where India and Middle East somewhere on the way. But you make the case it's absolutely not. This Silk Road phenomenon is barely 1,000-year-old, with the Genghis Khan and so on around that time.
Correct.
But before that, you make the case that there's really this golden road that you call, which is centered around India. There was a massive thriving trade between India and Rome, which is also a big surprise. I think you talk about as much as 1/3 of the foreign trade that Rome was engaged in, or the income that they were driving, was coming from their trade with India, which as a result was pouring all this gold into India, adding to the wealth of the nation. It's pretty fascinating. So, what are some of your findings around this? And so it's hard to believe this. We are talking about almost 2,200, 300 years ago.
So there's two different points there. One is about the Silk Road,
yeah,
and the other is about the Golden Road. So let's do the Silk Road first. So I, like you, always assume that the Silk Road is an idea that's always been there,
yeah,
that it's referred to, I would have imagined, in Chinese sources and ancient Roman sources. Bullshit. Turns out that it was invented by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen in 1877. He called it the Seidenstraßen. And that it first entered the English language only in 1936 with a Nazi sympathizing Swedish explorer called Sven Hedin. And it was only when I was a kid and at university in the 80s that it was really something that was becoming into the language and a new idea. At the same time, I think in the mid-80s, the Punjab highway opened in Pakistan, linking to China. Travelers started going from Pakistan over into Xinjiang and Kashgar, as I did in my first book, in Xanadu. But while the Mongols smashed a hole through the middle of Asia, destroying all the customs and borders and the political boundaries, allowing Marco Polo in 1271 to make this journey across Central Asia very quickly and efficiently, with a series of caravanserais along the way, changing horses, all that sort of thing was there by the 13th century. But in the classical period, which is what I'm dealing with in this book, there is no evidence that Rome was aware of China or China was aware of Rome. Beyond, there's vague ideas. In some of the Chinese sources, they talk about the mysterious Da Qin, which people think could be Rome, this mysterious power to the west. And in some Roman sources, there's late Roman sources, there's a mention of the city of Theiss, where silk comes from. It is difficult to get to.
Got it.
That's it. But in comparison, we know that from the moment, you remember in your literature classes, if you all had to study Antony Cleopatra, remember Antony Cleopatra commits suicide, Octavian takes over Egypt, and Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire. From that moment, the Red Sea coast becomes the frontier between Rome and India. Because thanks to the monsoon winds, which drive massively in the direction of the Red Sea every year for 6 months, and then helpfully for the next 6 months, drive back. You can just put up a sail anywhere from the West Indian coast and find yourself once you've learned how to ride the winds, which Indian sailors knew from quite early on, from kind of Indus Valley time. They seem to have understood this. Because, for example, there are grains of Indian black pepper up the nose of the mummy of Ramesses II.
Really?
Literally. Wow. So from that period, Indian sailors were going, but it massively accelerates once Rome and India discovered each other. And Strabo, who's a Roman geographer, describes going down the coast of the Red Sea with the new governor of Egypt and seeing a fleet of 250 vessels waiting to sail to India.
This is about, 200 BC or
180. So the Battle of Actium, when Octavian defeats Antony Cleopatra, is 46 BC. And so in the next 40 years, Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire. And suddenly everyone realizes you can just leave the Red Sea and in 2 months you're in.
What are these folks all trading back then? And what was effort like to take stuff from India all the way to Rome and so on? Let's just help the viewers understand what was going on between Rome and India, or what was even India back then.
So again, different questions there. So what is India? So India is defined very early on as being, and this is in the Mahabharata, but it's also, for example, the answer that Alexander the Great receives when he goes to Taxila. What is India? Where is it? bounded on the west by the Indus, on the east by the Ganges, and to the south by the sea. Very simple formulation. But India at this point was never one country. It was recognized as a cultural and geographical space, but it's hundreds of different statelets. And usually is. Unlike China, which is quite often united for most of history, India is mostly disunited. And there's occasional moments like Mauryas, or the Guptas, or the Mughals, the Delhi Sultanate, when it briefly sort of coheres a bit.
So all these different kingdoms were separately trading with.
So all these different kingdoms, all these different ports were separately trading. I mean, there are bigger kingdoms and smaller kingdoms. There's a Gujarat kingdom, there's the Satavahanas, the Guptas, and further to the east. But during the Roman period, you get a very, very regular trade. And we have the kind of equivalent of the Lonely Planet or the Rough Guide or the Outlook Traveler Guide or whatever you want to call it.
From that time.
Called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. It's a complicated title, but it's basically just a guide for merchants making that journey. And the fact that there was a guide implies in itself that there was a market for the guide. And it just lists every single port on the West Coast. Places like Sopara, which is where North Bombay now is. Barigaza, which is in Gujarat. He says that the king there had a taste for Roman singing boys. But the two big ones are Barbaricum, which is roughly modern Karachi, on the mouth of the Indus, where you can unload your stuff at this quay and then punt your stuff, because the Indus is very, very shallow. So you need flat-bottomed rafts. You can't take big sea-going vessels. So you sell your stuff at the quay, or have some associate that takes it up into Afghanistan and what's now Pakistan and Gandhara. And then the other big one in the south is Muziris, which is kind of Cochin. And there's a wonderful archaeologist called P.J. Cherin, who's digging it now. I was with him last week, and he just produced these amphorae from southern Italy. Because apparently the Malus at that period had a very connoisseur taste for South Italian wine.
Why not?
Why not?
If you have access to it.
Good Sicilian and South Italian wine. Anyway, so it's a big deal. And we have figures now, because about 20 years ago, a random document turned up, which is now known as the Muziris Papyrus. And that gives the data which economic historians were longing for, because it's just one shipping invoice of the sort that might be made out any day in Bombay. And it's giving a full list of items in one particular container, traveling one particular ship. We know the name, the Hamaplon. We know when it left, 120 AD. And we have a list of everything that was being exported. And it's 120 tons of ivory. That's a lot of dead elephants, I'm afraid. There is a lot of pepper.
You said 120 tons of ivory.
120 tons of ivory. Incredible. I get the impression that ivory was probably the biggest export from southern India. Not a nice thing to think about. There clearly were so many elephants. And Indians made a huge amount of money. And the second biggest thing is the pepper. And then there's cotton, there's silk. There's something called nard, which is used in sort of glands of some Himalayan animal, which they use, I think an antelope or something they use for perfumery in the Roman Empire. And musk, same as musk. And there's another thing called malabathrum, which is kind of cinnamon-like leaves, which is used both in cooking and in perfumery. Anyway, all these different things are put on in this container. And we have not only the exact price of the items in the container, we have the Roman customs take. And so the big surprise is how much this all costs, because your ancestors were ripping off my European ancestors something rotten. And there was vast sums of money being made on this trade route, because ivory, you didn't take a huge effort to bring down a few elephants, a few tuskers. Pepper was even easier. They just pick it off the vines, sell it to the Romans. And the other big thing is gemstones, which is not actually in the Muziris Papyrus, but was clearly a major export. And we know, for example, that Caligula's mistress, Lolina Paulina, used to appear at Roman parties with Indian gems all over her. Pearls, diamonds, which was an Indian monopoly,
Sometimes with
rubies.
receipts also you talk about in the book.
And she, in a sort of Punjabi touch, she apparently carried the receipts with her to the parties to show people how much they cost.
Some things never change.
Some things never change. It's like a big Punjabi wedding today in Delhi. Anyway, so the cost of this is such that if this container made it safely to Alexandria, and presumably because the receipt is that end, it did.
Right.
The shipper could have bought almost any estate in Egypt with the price of that container, the profits from that container. And also would have had enough spare change to join the Roman Senate. So you could become the kind of Elon Musk of Roman Egypt just by working this trade. This was the Bay Area. Yeah. This was the Silicon Valley of its time.
Yeah. So
if you want to make a fortune, this is what you're in.
So when we talk about this, glorious past in the country, Hindi mein Sone ki Chidiya, which is, the golden bird and all that, there is a lot of evidence that, there was this thriving trade. As you're saying, you're ripping off the Westerners, with this price.
Poor Westerners. I feel very sorry for them. I mean, you get the impression that your ancestors were slightly like the Saudis today. The Saudis don't really have to get out of bed. They just pump the oil out the ground.
Everything evens out in history. I think that's, second book talks about. But yeah, so it's good to know there was this period as well.
No, it really was. And it lasts, I mean, we'll get onto this later, but it lasts until the fall of Rome. And then you have this moment, and we'll come to this later, but you have this moment when the Tamil trading guilds react to this crisis because the fall of Rome, suddenly this gold stops coming.
Yeah.
For 400 years, people have barely had to sort of do an honest day's work, and suddenly, bang! There's no more gold coming from Rome. So the Tamil trading guilds pivot eastwards, and this is the period that you begin to find people going to Savarnabhumi, the lands of gold in Sarawak and Java and Borneo, and you begin to get references in the Jatakas and the Ramayana to Southeast Asia. And that's the second part.
Right. And before we come to there, there is this period also coincides with rise of Mauryas and Ashoka, and I think other thing I learned from the book that, despite, everything Ashoka did, in some ways, probably first ruler to really unite the, entire landmass under one kingdom, but he was largely unknown by the time of Britishers until we figured out all these stupas that he has, established all over India. He had this big change of heart.
I'm proud to say it was my great-great-great-uncle, James Prinsep, who decoded
all those. Incredible. So India's a lot more to owe to you and your family.
If you go to Calcutta, there's still Prinsep Ghat, which commemorates his...
Yeah.
So Ashoka didn't conquer the whole of India, but he conquered an area which is now not India, which is the whole of Kandahar and southern Afghanistan.
Yeah.
He only got as far as sort of Andhra.
Okay.
The whole of Tamil Nadu and Kerala were not conquered. But he sends what he calls Dharma ministers beyond his own kingdom. To the west, they reach as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. To the south, they go to Sri Lanka. And his big success is the conversion of the king of Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. And his son Mahinda goes there, he preaches for a week, and the whole of Sri Lanka converts to Buddhism and remains Buddhist till this day. And from that point, you get this extraordinary miracle, which again, I don't think gets as much, if you like, airtime in India as it deserves, which is the 300 years after Ashoka, when Buddhism just goes viral over the rest of Asia. It goes west and northwest up through Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bactria, through China to Mongolia, through China to the south down to Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Mekong Delta, Japan, Korea, Siberia. And what's important to remember is it's not just Buddhism and the ideas of the Buddha. With Buddhism comes Pali, Sanskrit, great chunks of Indian literature, the whole riches of Indian literature. Ideas of karma and reincarnation, ideas of Jambudvipa and geography, ideas of Indian conceptions of mathematics and counting. Those are all inherent in the Buddhist scripture. So if you read Buddhist scriptures, you take in a whole Indian world. So from a secular point of view, it's not just the philosophy or and religion of Buddhism. It's an Indic universe which spreads out. And its imprint is still there.
Right.
You can still see it when you go to Bali or to Japan.
So the picture that emerges, you have all these ideological things which are being developed here. These Buddhist monks are traveling pretty much as far as it was possible to travel in those times, taking not only this particular religion but also all the ideas from the subcontinent, and which is creating awareness in all those parts of the world. At some point, people from those parts of the world start coming back here. Which brings me to this Chinese monk.
Before we get to Xuanzang, I think is where you're leading. One quick thing, as a businessman, I think you'd be interested. The degree to which we often imagine Buddhism to be a religion of austerity and poverty and giving away your goods to the poor and that sort of thing. And it is in one way, but it's also a religion which had a very close relationship in ancient India with what we today would call capitalism, with merchants.
Yeah.
And the early Buddhist monasteries we know lent money. And in return, the merchants, on their return from trading voyages, would donate, in addition to repaying their debt, would donate to the monasteries. So when we go to, for example, outside Pune, there's a wonderful rock cut monastery called Karla. There's an inscription there saying, these 3 pillars are donated by the merchants of Sopara. And we get that sort of thing all over as well. And this continues not just within India, but right up into Afghanistan and so on. So Indian merchants will be staying in the monasteries. There'll be a guest house. They'll be safe there. And then they'll give something to the monastery. The monastery will expand.
Amazing. So they're acting as both lodging and banks and, just this whole network which enabling,
package of ideas that we don't associate with Buddhism. And in some cases, there's a site I visited in Afghanistan called Mez Aynak. Mez Aynak is about to be destroyed because it's on the largest copper deposit in Central Asia. And the Chinese have now got it and are about to dig it. But the point was that the monks originally went and found it because they also mined the copper. And that's what powered them. And then I was recently in Malaysia and in Bujang, which is another of these early centers of Indian export influence from the 5th century. And that, again, you find the Buddhist monasteries on iron ore deposits.
Yes.
So these guys were quietly, their businesses were operating. The nuns made textiles. There's a sort of proto-capitalism inherent in the Buddhist expansion. Too.
Religion also requires resources to thrive. So they figure out the right balance, and they're practicing this whole idea of philosopher king.
Exactly.
In how they were operating that. But, as a result, this almost like very first global network that was established through these monasteries and the back and forth. Monks are traveling and maybe the merchants traveling. They're providing safety to each other and creating all these routes and so on. And which eventually coming to these people coming back, coming from all over the world to study in India because they were so intrigued by the ideas that are being exported. They wanted to go to the root and learn from original scriptures. Which brings us to the gentleman Xuanzang, if I'm
so in the old textbooks, which I remember teaching when I was a teacher in Dehradun in the mid-80s, he used to be spelled Xuanzang, but the Chinese in its modern transliteration, he's Xuanzang. And so he is a kind of nerdy Buddhist monk who is worried that the translations he's using are corrupted. So in his view, he has to go back to the source, which is India. He also particularly wants something called the Yogacara text, which he can't find at all in China. So with these 2 ideas in his head, he sets off on foot.
And this is about 600 AD or so.
600 AD. And he crosses the
And in China, before, he was aware of existence of Nalanda and so on. That was his destination, or he discovers
Not only is he aware of the existence of Nalanda, he's aware of the particular teacher at Nalanda he wants to study under.
Right.
Silabhadra.
So just like somebody may want to go to Oxford today or Harvard today and study under a teacher, this guy knew exactly where he wanted to go.
And so he wants to go and meet Silabhadra. He wants to get access to these particular texts. And he crosses the Gobi Desert illegally. He gets arrested at one point. Another time, he nearly gets shot by a crossbowman when he's trying to get some water and the border guards think he's a robber or something. But anyway, luckily the guy is a Buddhist and rescues him and helps him on his way. Gets over the Pamirs, eventually gets to Nalanda. And Nalanda is again something which I don't think people make enough of here.
You talk about 9-story library there.
9-story library.
Still hard to believe.
And the shocking thing is that even today, only 10% of Nalanda has been dug. It's a vast complex. But when you go today, what is uncovered is 6 successive courtyards. And it's like Oxford High Street. Just like in Oxford High Street, you have Queen's College, All Souls, all these different University College lining the road. And each one you have scholars' rooms around a courtyard. this is what Nalanda is. And Nalanda comes up with that plan. Nalanda is the first place, or certainly the Buddhist universities of India come up with that plan, which then transmits itself to the madrasas of Islam, and then eventually becomes the universities of which are founded in 12th century Europe next to the Islamic world, or next to Spain, in Salerno, in Bologna, in Paris, and ultimately Oxford and Cambridge.
Incredible.
So India's influence reaches further. And this guy, Shailendra Rajmehta, has written this book coming out next year, which is I think going to knock everyone's socks off next year. But anyway, it's an extraordinary story. And Xuanzang spends 20 years at Nalanda translating texts.
So he learned Sanskrit and everything.
He, I think, knew Sanskrit before he went, but he certainly perfects it in India. He is given some elephants by King Harsha and a load of pack animals, and he gets nearly all his manuscripts back to China. One boat sinks on the Indus and loses some of his favorite manuscripts, but most of it makes it back intact. And the Emperor Taizong builds him a library, which is still there to this day, called the Wild Goose Pagoda, one of the most famous buildings in Xi'an. And what happens is, in the next generation, one of Xuanzang's proteges, who's this young woman, Wu Zetian, who was originally just a fifth-ranking concubine in the harem, but who is a Buddhist, and who was clearly a hottie, and got the eye of the emperor and the emperor's son, and ends up mysteriously moving from the harem of the father to being the first concubine of the son. She eventually becomes first empress, and then on the death of Gaizong, she becomes the only woman emperor in the whole history of China. Not Dowager Duchess, not Dowager Emperor,
not before, not since. She's the only person.
Only one. And she does it because the Confucians don't let women rule. It's one of the basic principles of Confucianism. Women are inferior, like peasants, says Confucius. So she has to appeal to Xuanzang's Nalanda-trained Buddhist monks. And you have effectively a sort of Indian coup d'etat, putting Wu Zetian on the throne. Wu Zetian organizes it, but she makes use of the Indian trained and ethnic Indian monks. And you briefly have for one reign, which is the high watermark ever of Indian influence in China, a basically Indian-looking Buddhist administration running China in the 660s.
Incredible.
And this is something I think no one here knows.
I've never heard of this before. I've read with a lot of fascination the book. She has all these Buddhist monks providing all the justification for her rule and all these prophecies. And they were I
think the Buddhist monks came up with prophecies to order, and she clearly rewarded them for. And they say, she's not only is she meant to be the empress, she's the reincarnation of a Devi that's mentioned in the Lotus Sutra. She's the reincarnation of Maitreya, the Bodhisattva, and we must build a city to Maitreya in Xi'an. So it's a huge sort of big sort of religious con job.
Politics and religion does find very interesting way to mix. And
it, of course, could never happen today.
Definitely not. Old times.
Old times. Exactly.
We are far evolved now.
Exactly. Can you imagine religion entering politics today?
No. It's but let's just go back to Nalanda for a second. Also, just help us visualize. What was going on there? What was a day in Nalanda like? How many people were there? What were they doing? Read this book next year, but just give us a glimpse of
10,000 monks. 100 lecture halls, 9-story library. You can borrow any book, any manuscript in the library, but you have to return it to a particular pigeonhole in the central courtyard at night, he says. Xuanzang is dazzled by it. He's come from his father. I think his grandfather was effectively the vice chancellor of the Chinese equivalent, the Confucian Academy, which trained civil servants. But he is there wide-eyed. No young scholar arriving at St. Stephen's or Oxbridge or Harvard has ever been more dazzled. And he gives this sort of wide-eyed account. He says the young and the old mutually help each other. everyone is clever and intelligent, and they all work hard. There is no time off. They study from dawn until dusk. There is a water clock. The time is regulated. There are gongs calling the hours. And in this sort of world before time, when people are not otherwise.
And how do you get in? Entrance exam?
Exactly, an entrance exam. So he's very proud about this. Xuanzang, who's obviously sort of, his reputation went for him because he was a considerable scholar. And he says how they came out to meet him. But other people, they have to pass, there's a gatehouse, and no one is allowed in until they've gone through a rigorous examination. And most people are turned away. So he very proudly says, I was welcomed in, but not everyone.
It's always a matter of prestige to get into a good university.
So exactly like that. It's like applying for colleges today. And in the 10% of Nalanda that's been excavated, only 10%, we found a copper plate from the king of Sri Vijaya, who is the ruler of what's now, I suppose, Indonesia, based in Sumatra. Who's giving a donation of 100 villages in order to support what's effectively, I think, an expatriate college for Southeast Asian monks studying at Nalanda. So imagine, like Ambani or someone donating a college to Oxford. That would be the modern equivalent, and giving a massive endowment to Harvard. The Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard is the modern equivalent. And it's an extraordinary moment in history. You have all these monks coming, not just from Japan, not just from China, not just from Indonesia, but Tibet, Korea, all over.
It's incredible. I think, this, I think the topic deserves its own book, and I'm glad Shailendra is doing something about that. And around this time, so as you said earlier, that, after the decline of Roman Empire, that trade kind of fizzled out. And then this Tamil merchant guild started looking eastwards. And by the time we get to 7th, 8th century, there is a not only vibrant trade, but a lot of cultural exchange. I think some of the folks started adopting both Buddhism and Hinduism. There's a huge influence. The remnants of that are still to be found. But entire Southeast Asia in some ways kind of came under massive influence of Indian ideology.
So this is the next stage. And it's interesting because there had been trade with Southeast Asia going right back. You have glass beads from India turning up from about 2000 BC. Or so. But when Rome falls and when the Indians have to work again, when Roman gold is not just falling into their laps, these Tamil trading guilds are incredible. And when I first read about them, there's some quite sort of dull academic work done on them that makes them sound quite sort of, trading guilds doesn't sound like the sort of stuff you really get excited about. Yet these guys were clearly badass. And rather like the East India Company, they have their own armies, or mercenary troops certainly, archers, spearmen, swordsmen on their ships. In some cases, they found little fortlets where they operate, sort of, rather like the East India Company founding Madras or Bombay or Calcutta. And my friend Anirudh Kanasetti, who you may know is a wonderful young historian, has recently come across some Chola inscription where it talks about them having a corps of assassins, like golden, like sort of Game of Thrones or something. Anyone that messes with their merchants gets not bumped off. So these guys were amazing, and there's some evidence that they were working in association with Rajendra and Rajaraja Chola. And that in 1016 and 1025, we get these raids by the Cholas on Southeast Asia. And it seems to me at least possible, if not probable, that the merchant guilds are putting the Cholas up for it. That it's not a territorial expansion. It's a rough diplomacy, a rough wooing, a show of force, rather like sort of Chinese sort of, rattling their sabers to try and get trading concessions or something today. And it works because we have from the 12th century several more inscriptions from the Tamil trading guilds around that area. So you have a trading empire which is going out to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is beginning to form into city-states often at the river estuaries where, like the Mekong comes down to the lagoon. You have settlements at Angkor Baray and Okeo on either side, in respectively Vietnam and Cambodia today, but also in Malaysia and in Thailand. And these estuary ports are receiving from the interior forest goods, aromatic woods, fancy feathers, all sorts of lovely things from the middle of the forests. And the Indian merchants are coming there. I went to this newly excavated site since I wrote the book called Bujang. And the archaeologist who's been digging that says that the actual trading ports were built of wood and have gone. You can't find anything now. But around the edges of these settlements are the Indian merchants build the first Hindu temples and Buddhist temples in Southeast Asia. And they were also built of wood, but the difference is they have brick platforms. So the brick platforms have survived. And I've seen those. Yeah. And they are the first Buddhist and Hindu temples in Southeast Asia.
And, by the time I think around 10th AD or so, the influence of, I think, Hinduism, there was one is this trade, but also there's a lot of adoption of religion or cultural practices. And there was this king, who kind of claims, what's the right word, that or usurping a lot of the titles that Indian kings were using and so on to derive legitimacy for his rule. And
I don't think it's usurping these. So what happens is that with the merchants come Brahmins, and the Brahmins are offered princesses, they're offered lands, they're often places at court. What do they give in exchange? Well, on a spiritual level, they provide access to these, local strongmen who are the kind of local guy with an army.
Yeah.
Let's call him Kadunga, which is the name in one of the inscriptions. He suddenly is offered the title Suryavarman, protected by Surya, or Mahendravarman, protected by Mahendra. And he now is not just the kind of local big guy. He's now Lord Shiva's friend or Surya's friend. But more practically, and this is what's always interesting, is that it happens because everyone is winning in this. Just like Wu Zetian got legitimacy because the Buddhist monks were giving her the prophecies. So the kings in Southeast Asia are getting Brahmins who are practiced in administration. They're used to tax gathering. They're literate. They've got numeracy. And these guys start doing the accounts. They start, so the whole range of ways this culture begins to take over the language and the court culture of Southeast Asia. So you begin to get not only Sanskrit names, but the use of Sanskrit. You begin to find in the sculptures, not just images of the main gods like Lord Shiva or lingams or small images of Lord Vishnu. You begin to get really sophisticated temples coming up with almost sort of nerdily perfect Sanskrit inscriptions that are orthographically absolutely right.
Including Angkor Wat, which is, I think, the largest Hindu temple ever built,
Yes, and I hate to say it because people, I don't think, know this, but the Khmer Empire might well be the largest Hindu empire ever, which is not necessarily what everyone
largest
wants to
by
hear.
The land, how old is their rule?
Yeah, it occupies more or less the whole of Southeast Asia.
Wow.
And as you say, Angkor Wat, built in 1120 by Suryavarman II, is the largest, not just the largest Hindu temple in the world originally, now Buddhist, but originally Hindu.
And I take it you must have been there.
I've been many times, and I love it. I off to Vietnam next week, which I'm looking forward to. This week, I'm off on Friday.
Oh, amazing! Okay, great. Yeah. Good trip. But this must have been a grand project. Must have taken, I don't know, dozens of years to build something of that scale and massive resources.
So I think 25 years it took to build Angkor Wat, but it had an enormous population. London in 1120 is about 20,000 people. Angkor Wat, Greater Angkor Wat, is about 1.2 million people.
Oh, wow.
3 harvests a year. Right. Incredible civilization on a different scale. And this is what's interesting, is that India initially is, giving everything to a more backward area where there are just small river ports. By the 1100s, you've got 2 mega empires in Southeast Asia. You've got Srivijaya, which is this confederation of the islands of Indonesia. And then on the landmass of Southeast Asia, you've got the Khmer Empire, which doesn't quite conquer the coast of Vietnam, doesn't conquer southern Thailand, but more or less conquers much of the rest of Southeast Asia. At the same time, when even South India is split between Pandya, Pallava, Chera, Chola. And so what you get is that the ideas transmitted from South India are built on a larger scale by the 9th, 10th, 11th century in Southeast Asia than in India. And then finally, this weird fact, which I don't think people in India have taken in, that the largest Hindu temple of the world is not in India. It's in Cambodia. I mean, how weird is that?
Yes, probably. Yes. Maybe it will change in coming decades. A lot of interest in building temples now.
Encourage.
But it's great to see. I mean, this is we're talking about something nearly 1,000 years ago, a project of that scale, and also influence of Indosphere, reaching far and wide. And around the same time, other interesting things starts to happen, which is so far what we've discussed. There's a very thriving trade. There's Buddhist monks, etc., traveling and trying to influence and so on. But in around 900 AD or so, there are these large Islamic empires are coming up in Baghdad and that area, and they realize that for as a source of knowledge, they need to look east and they need to import scholars and textbooks and get the translation done, which is also pretty fascinating, which in some ways starts Islamic Renaissance, which has a huge impact on the world later on.
Absolutely right. And what I think people don't know is this one important name, the Barmakid family. Now, the Barmakids are the hereditary abbots of the Buddhist monastery of Naubaha in Afghanistan. Xuanzang, our Chinese monk, stops with them on his way to Nalanda. And he says, after Nalanda, this is the best library, this is the biggest deal. And they convert to Islam. And the Sanskrit name of the family, Pramukh, gets arabicized to Barmak. And so when they eventually come to power as viziers, and they rise because they are trained in mathematics. And one of the members of the family, Khalid bin Barmak, is initially in his childhood, goes to Kashmir to study mathematics. Extraordinary moment. He ends up at the end of his life, vizier in Baghdad. First thing he does is he sends to India to get the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta. So we haven't talked about these guys in case.
Let's briefly touch upon that. These guys were doing some pioneering work in astronomy and math, and which was unknown anywhere in the world at the time.
So we have been talking about 1120s Cambodia. We're now going back to 550 Madhya Pradesh, Eastern UP. The Guptas are in charge. Chandragupta II particularly seems to have been very interested in astronomy and mathematics. He builds a major religious site at Udaygiri on the Tropic of Cancer, where you can still see observation platforms for whatever kind of stargazing equipment they were using. You can still find sight lines, water clocks, all sorts of means of calculating time and observing the heavens. And it's under these rulers that Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta flourish. So Aryabhatta is actually in the capital. He's in Pataliputra, right in the center of things. And he's this extraordinary genius who brings together, and this is important. Sometimes I think nationalist historians depict ancient India, particularly ancient India, Vedic India, as this sort of hermetically sealed Tupperware full of pure Indianness. My impression is that Aryabhatta is drawing on Babylonian, Persian, Greek, they call them the Yavana Sutras, all these different sources, and then he's taking them 3 or 4 steps forward, which is, of course, how scholarship works today. You don't just sit in your bath and come up
shoulder
with
of giants,
Exactly. And Aryabhatta calculates the exact circumference of the Earth, the exact distance of the Earth to the moon.
5th century AD.
And the fact that the Earth is spinning on its own axis, which you don't get in
Copernicus, 1,000 years later.
Exactly, 1,000 years later. Then the flame passes to Brahmagupta, who's about 75 years later. They can't have known each other, but they just sort of missed each other. But Brahmagupta certainly read Aryabhatta. And he's sitting, of all places, on Mount Abu in Rajasthan. And he's meditating on sunya, the void,
Mhm.
and he comes up with a series of definitions of zero.
Mhm.
Zero had been around before as a placeholder, as an
Mhm.
absence, but Aryabhata zero, which is a defined zero,
Mhm.
it's the number you get when you subtract a number from yourself, and he finds other definitions, allows zero to have the power
Mhm.
to create place value. So
Mhm.
0, tens, hundreds,
Mhm.
tens of thousands, binary.
Yeah.
It allows you to express
Mhm.
any number up to infinity with the 9 Indian numerals
Yeah.
and zero. And it's so obvious to us. We use zero every day on our phones, our calculators. We never think about it, but it's one of the great leaps of humanity, and it happened here.
Yeah, I think anyone who's tried in school the Roman numerals or any other thing, it's very cumbersome to work with numbers, and it gets so unwieldy by the time you get to 1,000 or so. And here, as you say, just 10 symbols, including very special use of zero. And I think from what I learned from your book is this was mostly known for nearly since probably around 0 AD or so, but Brahmagupta refines it and make it accessible in a mathematical language, and from there it starts traveling west.
So up to a point, that's right. He defines it and he expresses it, but accessible is not a word you use about Brahmagupta or Aryabhata. In that way of Sanskrit writing, it's not accessible. It's highly complex. It's terribly dense. It's very short, their works.
Yeah, scholars sometimes keeping language that way.
Exactly. And it's poetry, bizarrely. They write their mathematical theory in poetry, in rhyming poetry. So along with Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, both of them come mountains of commentary, unraveling them. And what happens in the Arab world, not immediately, but a generation later, or 2 generations later, after Brahmagupta and Aryabhata have been delivered to Baghdad in 776 by this embassy from Sind on order from the Barmakids. There's an initial attempt at translation by a guy called Al-Fazari that doesn't go very far. But a genius turns up 2 generations later, and he's called Al-Khwarizmi because he's from Khwarazm, which is modern Uzbekistan. He's not a native of Baghdad. He's come a long way down from Central Asia. And he might also have been from a Sanskrit literate family, as the Barmakids were. There's some theories that he came from that. He could have been also from the ancient Magi of Persia, who were the astronomers of Persia. But anyway, he arrives in Baghdad. He finds all these works of Sanskrit sitting in the Beit al-Hikmah, which is the Nalanda of Baghdad, the house of wisdom. And he translates it, mixing it with a bit of Euclid, a bit of Greek work. And where Brahmagupta and Aryabhata had been brilliant, but dense and difficult and designed for rote learning, Al-Khwarizmi writes in mellifluous, easy, and accessible Arabic prose. And yet he calls his book this kind of mouthful. He calls it the compendious book of balancing and completion according to Hindu calculation. So no one calls it that because it's just too much of a mouthful. They know it by a nickname, which is
Algebra.
Which is the word of algebra.
Yeah.
And his name, Al-Khwarizmi, becomes our word
algorithm.
Yeah.
Amazing. It's a fascinating history. It's also, different cultures working together. And as you were saying earlier, they're building upon the work of each other. Is great to hear.
It's a relay race.
Yeah.
And the relay race hasn't finished so this spreads around the Arab world. And by the 10th century, remember in those days, the Arab world extends as far as Spain. It's only in the 11th century that Spain begins to be reconquered by Christendom. So it reaches Barcelona, which is just over the Christian border. And by 11th century, you've got some Christian monks, including a future pope. The future Pope Sylvester comes and studies at the monastery of Ripoll. So he's aware of these 9 Indian figures and 0 in 9 something, 8 something. But amazingly, it takes another 300 years for it to really catch on in Europe. And the guy who is responsible is brought up in Algeria. He's from Pisa. He's an Italian. His dad runs the Pisan trading company in Algeria. They're selling stuff backs and forwards to the city-state of Pisa. And this kid is brought up in Algeria. He learns Arabic. He learns Al-Khwarizmi because every kid at school by now can read this stuff. And this is across the Islamic world. Everyone's reading the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhata in Al-Khwarizmi's version.
Yeah.
And this guy, luckily for us, is Fibonacci. Fibonacci goes back to Italy and finds his friends, aged 18, are still doing MCV, XV, X, all the kind of Roman numerals, and writes a book called the Liber Abaci, the Book of Numbers, which he says is to teach the modus Indorum, which is the Indian method, using the 9 Hindu numbers and 0. And this reaches the ears of the Holy Roman Emperor, who is an intellectual called Frederick II, who comes all the way up to Pisa to meet the mathematician, this young nerd. This guy. Imagine Biden going to meet some young maths nerd in San Diego or something. That's the equivalent. And Frederick II comes to Pisa, embraces Fibonacci. He says, "Come to my castle. You must join my court." And there he meets a Scotsman, I'm glad to say, who's called Michael Scott, who's the astronomer at the court. And Michael Scott reads Fibonacci's work and says, "Look, this is brilliant, but it's too theoretical. No one's going to understand the implications of this unless you point it out. So we've got to add currency conversion, double accounting, weights and measures, all the stuff that merchants and bankers are going to need." And it's the second edition of the Liber Abaci, rewritten and dedicated to Michael Scott, that goes viral in Italy. It creates the Medici Bank, all the Italian banking revolution. It also helps spur on the Italian Renaissance in painting. The painter Piero della Francesca reads Fibonacci, starts writing about how you can use it to calculate perspective. He writes 3 mathematical treatises, which his friend, who's called Friar Luca Caroli, then carries to Milan and shares with his flatmate, who's another painter called Leonardo da Vinci. And so we have this relay race. So Aryabhatta to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Leonardo.
And and this is incredible intellectual relay race, right? It's over almost 1,000-year period, helps create the the decimal system that we all use, the double book, the double entry accounting, so many fundamentals on which in some ways the Renaissance, later on industrialization,
and finally the East India
Company, which is we'll talk about that in a second episode. It's like full circle of life. This comes back and sadly, in some ways,
sadly it screws India.
But it's a fascinating history, and I think it's amazing William, that you were to take time and
thank you,
really help us in India understand that 1,500 years of this glorious period. There is you have so many stories, but I'm assuming that's still just a sliver of what all transpired. 1,500 is a very long period of time. A lot happened that we still probably don't know. The books like this book that coming on Nalanda, and I'm sure there are many more probably that we will need in the coming decades or years to really understand what all happened and what we can go back and just feel proud of, learn from, not repeat same mistakes and so on, and kind of just factor that in as we think to what India is going to be in the coming century.
The wonderful thing is that I think people know bits of this, but I think this is the first time since A.L. Basham in 1954 wrote that wonderful book, The Wonder That Was India, that anyone sort of brought it together into one thing. And what I have done is that a full third of the book is footnotes for those that want to learn more in bibliography. So if this appeals and if this kind of thing lights your candle, there is a whole world of reading. I mean, many Indian scholars have been working at this for decades. One woman we should mention straight up is the wonderful Himanshu Prabharai, who is not a household name in India, but who has done all the work on Indian maritime history and the spread of Indian ideas. And there's wonderful research out there. So if you enjoy this book, you can spend months mining, I hope, the notes and the footnotes. And
absolutely. And I will not feel hesitant in, very strongly endorsing. And I know there's a lot of interest in learning about India. This is, the book looks daunting, but still, it took me about just 10, 11 hours to read it. So it's, manageable. You can do it in 2-3 days as well. And as you rightly said, there are so many footnotes and pointers to other resources. I think there is no such thing as a definitive history. It's a perspective, a point of view.
Yeah.
But it gives you a lot of pointers and a lot of things that you can verify for yourself, or maybe even found alternate viewpoints. But the thing is,
I'm sure future generations will find all sorts of things to disagree with here and take this forward. But what I think this does do is bring together the state of the argument. And as I will say in the footnotes, many of the conclusions I've reached, other scholars think differently about individual things. So you may disagree with some things, I may be wrong about some things, but I think the general picture needs emphasizing, and it's something we've oddly forgotten. Why is it that a kid in California or a kid in London or a kid in Rome has heard of Archimedes, Pythagoras, but has never heard of Aryabhata or Brahmagupta? That shouldn't be the case. In this 21st century, we should learn about both.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a fascinating story, and you are a great storyteller. I mean, the book is, it's not a terse, dense history book. It's like really enjoyable. It's like almost a page turner. So I think hopefully a lot more people will read it. And once again, thank you very much, William, for writing the book and for talking to me about the content.
Thank you so much.
At Sparks, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to Sparks on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.